Hey guys, Dave here with Gray Op CNC. Today we're going to go over assembling the track for your mover system. Some of the video can be a little bit hard to hear what's going on, so I'll be your commentator along the way, kind of explaining what's going on and making sure you don't miss any steps. So with that said, let's get into it. I want to touch on this slide real quick because it's important. So there's two different types of track you'll build. There's end sections and there's middle sections. The end sections will be the same, and that's because there's a control box on one end and there's a tensioning rod on the other. So the interfaces are a little bit different. And then all your middle sections will be the same as well because they're just basically connecting to each other. So here is an end section track example. And you'll see the cross ties, and that's what's connecting the two long box rail sections together. So you have regular cross ties and you have end cross ties. The end cross ties are obviously going to be used at the very end, at the beginning of your track and the end of the track. And they're a little bit different than the regular cross ties, so don't mix them up. There's extra holes in them, and there's a template that you'll use to lay those out and screw those down, which will be shown in the video a little bit later. But just keep in mind, this is an example of the first track and the last track. And then this slide here is an example of a regular cross tie. Those will be your middle sections. They get regular cross ties all the way through, and there's no double up of the cross ties at the end. Okay, so we're gonna start off by assembling an end section first. And what we've got here are two box rails laid out on a very level surface, and we're using the wooden spacers and the clamps to clamp them together. You don't have to squeeze very hard, just light pressure to keep everything in place. And before you clamp the other side down, you're gonna wanna square that end off to make sure everything's square. You'll hear that throughout the video. Everything is based off of how square you can get this track. The more square you can get it, the better the mover is going to run. So the end is squared, and now we're locking down the other clamp with the spacer and the clamps. This will be where we install our first cross tie, and this will be in the middle of the track. We start with the middle and not the ends. You'll use 4 self-tapping screws, and we go right dead center in the middle of the track. I think it's 59.5 inches, and you'll install all 4 self-tapping screws. Then we'll move down, and we're going to use an end cross tie, which has extra holes in it. So we'll put the 4 self-tapping screws. We'll lay out our second end cross tie and use the 3D printed plastic template to get your spacing correct. We're dropping in the supplied bolts from the hardware pack. And then installing the self-tapping screws to that second end cross tie. Now we'll move to the other end of the track and use the spacer to get its spacing perfect, and we'll use a regular cross tie. And we'll install the 4 self-tapping screws there too. Now our end cross ties have something special because there's a little extra force there. We use a 1/4 inch drill. There's already a pilot hole for you, but you've got to use the pilot hole and drill through the box rail. We're going to install a bolt through there to assist the self-tapping screws and make sure that it's solid. So install the bolts. And then you have to flip it up on its side to access and try threading a nut on by hand, and then you can use the power tools to lock it the rest of the way down. and flip it over and repeat the process with 2 bolts, 2 nuts. And that is your first end section complete. Okay, now that the first section is complete, we're going to start our second section of track. And we're going to use and build off of the first section so that the first builds right into the second. So we start with the cross tie, we'll install the bolts and our cross tie for track number 2. We'll connect it right to the cross tie from track number 1. We'll just put those on hand tight. Now what we're doing is using an extra box rail to straddle track number 1 and track number 2. And basically that's just keeping them straight. So track number 1 and track number 2 are perfectly straight because we've just clamped that extra box rail connecting the 2 tracks. And then we'll install our spacer. To get the other side of track number 2 square to the first side of track number 2. And once everything looks good and everything's tight and square, we'll go ahead and put our self-tapping screws in to a regular cross tie. Now we're going to measure 59.5 inches to put our cross tie right in the middle of track number 2. And this will be a regular cross tie as well. We'll square that up, make some marks. And install the 4 self-tapping screws into that cross tie of track number 2. We'll steal that spacer from the far end of the track. And we really don't need that box rail for straightness anymore. So we'll move that spacer down here to the end so that we can install our next cross tie. Four self-tapping screws. And this track section is complete, so it's important to mark these track sections with 2s, 3s, 4s, so that you know the order that they were built. And you can go ahead and separate track number 1 from track number 2 and move track number 1 out of the way. We're going to take track number 2 and slide it down. So that we can begin installing track number 3 off of track number 2 in the same manner that we just did. So we'll start by attaching our extra box rail as a straightening device and clamping that onto track number 2. In this process, we'll repeat until we get to the last track section. Okay, this is our last section of track that we need to build, so it's an end section. What we're doing here, we ran out of box rail to use as a straightening device, so we're just going to use a finished section of track to connect the 2 tracks that we're working with. We'll clamp those on hand tight. And we'll use our spacers to get the other side square to our straight side. We'll install our cross tie. So we'll use the bolts and connect the 2 tracks together. Our finished track with the track we're working on. You can make those hand tight. And then we'll install our 4 self-tapping screws. Then we'll move to the middle of the track, 59.5 inches squared off, and we'll install another regular cross tie in the middle. And then we'll move to the end. And it's important to get this last cross tie square. So being either 5 sections or 8 sections long, we could be off a little bit. So we're going to want to mark that and just make sure it's perpendicular to the track. So if you have to leave a little gap on the one end, that's okay. And we'll install the 4 self-tapping screws. We'll grab another end cross tie and we'll use the plastic jig and the bolts to get the spacing correct. And we'll install those 4 self-tapping screws. And just like we did in the very first track section we built, we need to use a 1/4-inch drill bit, follow those pilot holes, and drill through the box rail. And this is for our safety bolts, since this is an end track section. So we'll install these bolts, and then we'll have to flip the track up on its side in order to put the nuts on. We'll put the bolts on, we'll put the nuts on by hand first, and then we'll switch over to a power drill. And we'll flip it over and repeat for the other side. Now we're installing the tension bracket. We'll use the provided bolts, and they should fit right in the template on the bottom side of the tension bracket. And unless you have perfectly positioned hands and everything else, you can't get access to install those bolts. So it does help if you remove the arm of the tension bracket to get a little better access. And then once you get everything snugged up, you can just reinstall the tension arm. And that concludes the track assembly for the Gray Ops Mover Target System. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. But it's really that simple. The first and last section are the same, and the middle sections are the same. And make sure you number them in the order that you built them so that you can assemble it in the field in the same order. It'll just prevent any extra problems with fitment and alignment as the mover cart moves across the rails. Thanks, guys.